link is actually Cyprus, and I'll try to express and identify this link in a few minutes. So it is clear that the Second World War was the bloodiest war in world history, and according to estimations, although it's very difficult to have accurate numbers, more than 73 million people, soldiers and civilians, lost their life. But besides that, one of the most serious problems emerged as a result of the Second World War was that of the displaced persons. With the term displaced persons being defined all the people who were forced to leave their home because of war and found themselves in liberal or conquered areas. This is something acceptable and written in Evgen Kulishev's famous book about the displacement of population in Europe. Kulishev was the people who made broad research on the displaced people just before the establishment of UNRWA, who from 1943 was responsible for the repatriation of the displaced Europe in the whole war. As you can see from the definition for the displaced persons, the term was by purpose broad. And the reason for that, it was in order to include all the different groups of population, and these groups were refugees, the Jews who had survived from the Holocaust, unaccompanied children, violently recruited workers who have been transferred in the Axis countries, and German settlers in other European regions. So with the term, because it was very difficult to define the different categories, who was actually a displaced persons, they, by purpose, set a broad term in order to include the majority of. After that, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, better known as UNRWA, established in 1943, was responsible for the repatriation of the displaced persons in their motherlands. It has been estimated that more than 21 million displaced persons were found in Europe in the middle of 1943, and it was actually a huge problem for everybody in Europe. So, if we are moving to the case of Greece, there are different categories of displaced persons, but I will focus especially on the Greek refugees, and we can see two basic waves of Greek refugees during World War I. The first one was as a result of the humanitarian crisis in Greece in this terrible winter, the first winter of Greek occupation, 1941-1942, where thousands of Greeks, especially in the main cities like Athens and Piraeus and in some isolated islands, fell into starvation, and many of them lost their lives. The second phase, causing movement of refugees from occupied Greece, happened in late 1943, and it was the result of the bombardment, heavy bombardment of Greece and mainly of some Greek islands into the Aegean by Luftwaffe, and it was the case after the capitulation of Italy. Italy passed to the camp of of the British and the Americans and their allies. So in some places of Greece, we had in late 1943 heavy battles and bombardment by Luftwaffe. And this is the ruins of one of the most famous, but although small one, Greek island, the island of Castellorizo in Dodekanis. So starting from November 1941 till the April of 1944, more than 25,000 Greek islanders crossed the Aegean and fled to Turkey, mainly to Turkey. As I already mentioned, we could identify too many waves of Greek refugees. The first one during the winter of 1941-1942, and the second one after September 1943. In these maps you can see the routes followed by the Greek refugees towards the rescue in the Turkish coast, the Middle East and Africa, the island of Chios, who was actually a place where thousands of Greek refugees fled to Turkey. They arrived by small boats first to Çeşme and then to the outskirts of Izmir. And in these places, the exiled Greek government, with the help of the British authorities in Middle East, tried first to provide some humanitarian aid for the Greek refugees and then to move them to the safer areas. And the first place which used as a transit camp was Aleppo in Syria. So these refugees moved mainly by train, then in Aleppo, where they stayed there for approximately 2 or 3 weeks. There it has been made a registration by the British authorities, and then all these refugees moved to some other safer places, either in Palestine, in Egypt, or in some other parts of Africa. This is a story of one of these Greek refugees who's still alive, Ioannis Stekas, who at the age of 6, along with his mother, started his long journey via Egypt, then to Dar es Salaam off the coast of Tanzania, and then he was settled like thousands of other Greek refugees to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is his testimony here. So in this map you can see the main 6 refugee camps settled in the Middle East and in Egypt, where thousands, not just, as we saw you in a minute, not just Greeks, but many other Europeans, refugees established during the Second World War. It was Aleppo, Nuseirat, Tolumba, Katadba, Moses, Wells, and El Sad. And this is a report showing us the numbers and the distribution by age of all these European refugees settled in these 6 main camps. And you can see most of them were Yugoslavs, Greeks, and you can see the differentiation between Greeks and Dodecanese during the same period, because Dodecanese was incorporated into the Greek state just after the Second World War. You can see among them some Italians who were prisoners, of course, of war, Spanish, one Cypriot, Albanians, Americans, etc., etc. This report was from the United Nations archives in New York. It was actually the UNRWA archive there. And this is the diagram shows us the distribution of the refugees in all these 6 camps. Moreover, a lot of Greek refugees more than 5,000, and in that number I include just the civilians, not the soldiers. Greek Christians moved to Cyprus during the same period as well, and this is a photo from a Greek Cypriot newspaper showing us a photo from of a ship carrying Greek refugees in Cyprus. These Greek refugees, as I told you, more than 5,000 Greek Christians established by the colonial British authorities with the support, a great support actually, by the Greek community here in Cyprus, mainly in 5 refugee camps, Xeros, Kuriotissa, and some other places, and in some cities and small villages as well. And all these refugees remained there till, like all the other Greek refugees, till the liberation of Greece after 1945, when UNRWA facilitated the repatriation towards Greece. And in this diagram you can see the arrival, actually the increase of the Greek refugees in Cyprus, starting from the late 1942 till the beginning of 1945. Actually, the most serious period was in the late 1943, when in the first wave of the Greek refugees, the second wave of Greek Christian refugees arrived to Cyprus, mainly from the Dodecanese. And this is the distribution of Greek Christian refugees in Cyprus, in Zigi, Xiros, Skouriotissa, and Mavrovouni. These 4 main refugee camps in Cyprus. It was actually a very difficult problem for the British authorities of Cyprus to deal with, because especially during late 1943, as I told you, waves of Greek Christian refugees starting to arrive massively in Cyprus. So in October 1943, the British governor of Cyprus, Sir Chasgouli, asked to transfer and settle, was asked by the Middle East military headquarters to transfer and settle in Cyprus immediately more than 1,000 Greek refugees from Castellorizo because of the ongoing bombings of the island. So the situation was actually very worse than it was expected, and during November and December 1943, approximately 2,500 Greek Christian refugees from the Dodecanese resorted to Cyprus. This refugee flow was impressive, and it was expected to be increased as the information the British started to collect from the East Aegean demonstrated. And there are a lot of documents keeping in the British archive about the issue. So, as a result, the British authorities in Cyprus found themselves unable to receive and settle all these refugees, and they asked for the immediate transport of them in Palestine. At the same time, the British authorities of Palestine, late in 1943, were informed to be ready to receive and care about 20,000 Dodecanese and refugees from another Greek island of Samos. The British intention was the result of the tragic situation in which the Greek refugees had fallen. The majority of them were malnourished at the borders of hunger, actually, lived in ruins or in the countryside amid unfavorable weather conditions, and the clothing they had was actually poor. And this is what is written in the British archive word by word. So according to the British plans, the most suitable solution for the refugee settlement was to place them in the Athlete and Nusayra camps run by Mer. And this is the link with the Jewish refugees coming to Cyprus and on their way towards Palestine. An alternative solution was to send several refugees to the Sinai Peninsula, to the camp of Moses Wells, but actually Moses Wells and Nusayra was overcrowded during the period, so there was actually a very difficult problem for the British to solve it. What happened at the end? According to the British plans, the transfers of the Greek refugees from Cyprus to the Middle East would begin in December 1943, and the plan was for the refugees to arrive by sea in Haifa, and then, according to Mera's instruction, the Mera was the special committee, British committee, responsible till the establishment of UNRWA to help the refugees and all these displaced persons moving to safer areas. So the plan was for all these refugees to channel into the athlete camp and stay there for a long time, and if it was possible, then to send them in Nusayra and Moses Wells. However, this plan of the British authorities in Cyprus caused the immediate reaction of their colleagues serving in Palestine. The British authorities in Palestine were opposed to the farmer movement of Greek refugees on the grounds that Palestine was not a refugee reception camp. They even expressed their deep dissatisfaction with the possibility of using the athlete camp, arguing that it was devoted exclusively to hosting Jewish refugees and immigrants. They added, in addition, that about 1,000 Jews were soon expected from Poland and Yemen, and therefore there was no room for others, and especially for the Greeks. And then started a big, yes, I'm finishing. And then started a big discussion between the British in Cyprus and Palestine, and so after that, the final solution was. And it was proposed and actually adopted by the British, was the immediate transfer to Palestine, not of the Greek refugees, but of 250 Jewish refugees who were already in Cyprus, as a counterpart to the non-transfer of the Greek refugees there. So this was the final solution, and the Greeks remained in Cyprus, although the original plan was to move them to Athlete. And then, from the beginning of 1944, they started to move not to Athlete, but in Nusayra and Moses Wells, although these camps were overcrowded. And this was the end. So these approximately 4,000 Greeks remained in Cyprus, and then about 1,000 more Greeks transferred to these two other camps, and so Athlete remained just a camp hosting the Jewish refugees. And on the same period, the British started to move from the Athlete camp some Poland refugees who were there. They moved them to Eritrea. Actually, I have finished, and with some photos. This is the Nusayra refugee camp. This is a painting from a famous British painter who was serving at these camps during the same period. And this is the repatriation after 1945 of the Greek refugees. This is a group of Greek refugees arriving back in the island of Ikaria. And repatriation, and you can see the ruins over there. This was actually the fate of the displaced persons all over Europe during the Second World War. It was actually a tragic one, although in the case of the Greek refugees, it was proved with a good end, because almost all of them returned to their motherland. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Yakovos. I think we should take questions at the end, otherwise we'll be too late. Our next speaker is Professor Aryeh Kochavi of the University of Haifa, an eminent Holocaust scholar and head of the Holocaust Studies program there.
Good morning. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 250,000 survivors of the Holocaust fled from countries in Eastern Europe and the Balkans westward, where they were given temporary shelter in the displaced person camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy. The Zionists tried to bring as many Jewish refugees as they could to the shores of Palestine through clandestine sailings from both sides of the Iron Curtain. Britain, the mandatory power in Palestine, invested considerable effort in preventing what it called illegal sailings in an effort to preserve its standing in the Middle East. At the end of the Second World War, the mandatory government in Palestine still retained approximately 11,000 immigration certificates of the 75,000 that had been allotted to the Zionists in May 1939. The Jewish Agency rejected a British offer to issue 1,500 visas per month to be charged against the remaining certificates, instead demanding that 100,000 Jews be allowed to enter Palestine. This, in turn, was firmly opposed by the British. The Arab countries warned London that continuing Jewish immigration without Arab consent was likely, I quote, to result in a wave of hostility throughout the Arab countries, spreading to the Muslims of India and threatening Great Britain's whole position in the Middle East. Toward the end of 1945, only 400 certificates of the 1939 quota remained, when 900 illegal immigrants who had sailed from Italy were intercepted. The mandatory government in Palestine decided to hold the Jewish refugees in the detention camp in Atlit. Fearing a Zionist attack on the detention camp in Atlit, the British government decided to continue the monthly quota of 1,500 certificates for 3 more months, believing that by then the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry regarding the problems of European Jewry in Palestine would publish its recommendations. The role of the committee was to examine the position of the Jews in British and American-occupied Europe, estimate the number of Jews who could not be resettled in their countries of origin, look into the possibility of relocating DPs in non-European countries, and consider other ways of meeting the needs stemming from the situation. Meanwhile, the British pondered measures to stop the illegal sailings, realizing that detaining the captured immigrants in Palestine was not a sufficient deterrent, since every illegal immigrants, as the British called the Jewish refugees, the overwhelming majority of them survivors of the Holocaust, knew that from the moment he or she was able to board a boat for Palestine, eventual entry into the country was guaranteed, either illegally or as part of the certificate quota. At the end of February 1946, British commanders in the Middle East suggested 2 courses of action. First, to cut off embarkation at the source, namely from Italy, France, and Greece, and second, to deport all illegal immigrants who would be apprehended to the ports of departure. The latter action, it was hoped, would compel the countries from which illegal immigrants had been sailing to increase their activities against the movements of the Jewish refugees within their jurisdiction. The recommendation called for the deportation of the illegal immigrants first to detention camps outside Palestine, for example, Cyprus, and from there to the ports of embarkation. The British Colonial Office adamantly opposed this proposal, fearing the reaction of the Yishuv, the Hebrew term for the pre-state Jewish community in Palestine. Moreover, its leaders maintained that the suggestion to return the illegal immigrants to their countries of origin was impractical, since no one knew where these Jews, who had wandered across more than half of Europe before managing to set for Palestine, had originally come from. Furthermore, at the time, the British government preferred not to take extreme actions against the illegal immigration as long as negotiations with the Americans on a comprehensive solution of the Palestine question were in progress. The policy, however, was contingent on the number of illegal immigrants detained by the Palestinian government not surpassing the monthly quota of certificates. By the spring of 1946, the number of illegal immigrants exceeded the monthly quota. The colonial office thus advised detaining the illegal immigrants in camps in Palestine and releasing them against the quotas allotted in the following months. The British High Commissioner in Palestine, Lord Cunningham, remained apprehensive of the possible reaction of the Yishuv and of attempts to free the illegal immigrants by force. Still, the colonial office insisted that because of the temporary uncertainty regarding the future policy in Palestine, every effort should be made to persist within the present policy. The British Chief of Staff, however, were concerned about the extra burden on the military as a result of the escalation of the illegal immigration and the need to hold the illegal immigrants in detention camps at a time when the Palestine police force was understaffed by about 50%. They urged the colonial office to reconsider its opposition to the deportation of the illegal immigrants to a British occupation zone. The colonial office opposed the idea because of the reaction it was expected to provoke in the Yishuv. The office also warned of the probable political consequences in the United States if the illegal immigrants were deported to Tobruk, for example. Britain, it stressed, would be accused of transferring the Jews from one concentration camp in Europe to another one in North Africa. Over the course of the summer of 1946, the British were confronted with a rather complicated situation. On the one hand, the pace of Jewish illegal immigrants' arrivals had increased significantly, and the security situation in Palestine has seriously deteriorated, while on the other hand, these discussions with the Americans regarding a solution to the Palestine question had reached a critical stage. As it attached great importance to the formulation of a joint American-British policy for a solution of the Palestine question, the British cabinet preferred to avoid taking more severe measures against the illegal immigrants so as not to jeopardize the discussions with the Americans. Military elements, however, warned of the dangers Britain could expect in Palestine, possibly in the entire Middle East, if no swift action was taken against the illegal immigration. Meanwhile, tension in Palestine further increased following the bombing of the King David Hotel on 22 July 1946 by the Jewish Underground, the National Military Organization, in which, among others, 41 Arabs were killed. Fearing the Arab reaction, the British High Commissioner in Palestine advised stopping the immigration to Palestine altogether, proposing that vessels carrying illegal immigrants that had set out from areas under Western control be returned to the points of embarkation, and that ships arriving from Balkan ports under Russian control be sent to Tripoli or to Cyprus. Cunningham thought that since confrontation with the issue following the deportation of illegal immigrants was inevitable, the clash might as well occur sooner than later. While the British cabinet was forced to review its position, another illegal immigration ship which had sailed from Yugoslavia with almost 2,700 illegal immigrants on board was detained, and there were also reports of 500 illegal immigrants who were scheduled to arrive on another ship soon thereafter. The cabinet decided to accept the advice of Prime Minister Clement Attlee to let the women and children go free and detain the men in Palestine for an undefined period of time. British military authorities did not favor the cabinet decision and warned of the dangers if Britain became simultaneously involved in incidents with Arabs and Jews. The High Commissioner also warned that it would be impossible to hold additional illegal immigrants in Palestine and that if more ships arrived, the situation would become intolerable. Nevertheless, the Prime Minister preferred to avoid taking any drastic action before US President Harry Truman had made up his mind with regard to a plan to solve the Arab-Israel conflict that was feared by the Whitehall, I'm talking about the Morrison-Grady plan. Heavy pressure by both the military and civilian authorities in Palestine on the government continued and led the government to decide on 7 August to deport illegal immigrants to Cyprus before they reached Palestine. The British military authorities in Palestine assured the cabinet that they were ready to implement the deportation and that they prepared themselves for the expected adverse reaction of the Yishuv. By that time, there were approximately 2,300 illegal immigrants detainees in the camp of Atlit, another 2,200 being held on the deck of a boat in the port of Haifa, and yet another 2,500 illegal immigrants already on their way to Palestine. Still, the cabinet waited with the announcement until the final American decision. On 12 August 1946, President Truman had told the British that he was unable to support the Morrison-Grady proposal. The following day, London published its new policy of deporting illegal immigrants to Cyprus. The announcement sharply criticized the illegal immigration, stating that it was not a spontaneous manifestation on the part of Jews who saw Palestine as their only hope, but a highly organized movement, financed largely by Zionist sources, led by unscrupulous people who were disobeying the laws of many countries and exploiting the distress of Jewish refugees to further their own political aims in Palestine. The statement also blamed the illegal immigrants for joining terrorist organizations in Palestine and exacerbating the tension between Jews and Arabs in the country. The announcement clearly specified that the illegal immigrants would be held in detention camps in Cyprus, while their future was being decided. The statement ignored the fact that the overwhelming majority of these illegal immigrants were survivors of the Holocaust, the last remnants of their murdered families. Britain's decision to deport to Cyprus marked a watershed in the British struggle against Jewish illegal immigration to Palestine. By the end of the summer of 1946, the two main factors that helped explain British restraint vis-à-vis illegal Jewish immigration, apprehension about the reaction of Truman and of American public opinion, and fear of possible reprisal on the part of the Yishuv, had lost their deterrent effect. The bombing of the King David Hotel in July had also made it easier for the military to convince the cabinet that harsher measures against the illegal immigration was necessary if Britain did not want the security situation in Palestine to deteriorate further. Very quickly, the British were forced to realize that the deportation of illegal immigrants to Cyprus did not limit the extent of the illegal immigration, while the shortage of internment facilities in Cyprus had become a troublesome burden. When the cabinet debated the deportation proposal, no one in London expected that deportations would continue to more than 6 months. Soon it became clear that the original plan, which foresaw the detention of 10,000 persons, was inadequate. Sir Charles Woolley, the governor of Cyprus, was asked to look into the possibility of enlarging the capacity of the detention camps to 20,000. Woolley warned of the negative reaction that could be expected from the local population and added that he did not want to see the island transformed into a detention camp from unlimited numbers of illegal immigrants. He set the maximum number of detainees who could be kept on the island at 15,000 and suggested Cyrenaica or Tripoli as an alternative locations. The main disadvantage of these two places was that the distance between Haifa and Cyrenaica was 5 times that between Haifa and Cyprus, and the distance to Tripoli was 7 times. 1 month after deportation to Cyprus had begun, the governor of Cyprus was forced to agree to increase the capacity of the camps on the island to 20,000. Zionist efforts to influence the British to alter or at least moderate their immigration policy came to nothing. The only compromise that the colonial office was willing to make was to allocate half of the monthly quota of immigration certificates, 750, to illegal immigrants detained in Cyprus. Such a move did not constitute a departure from the existing immigration policy and did not ease the shortage of internment space. This gesture was received with indifference by the Jewish public in Palestine, since the deportations to Cyprus continued. Britain's decision to continue with the deportation had been influenced by the increasing pressure on the part of the Arabs not to make any concessions on Jewish immigration. The British High Commissioner in Palestine reported to London that even forcing the illegal vessels to go to Cyprus did not satisfy the Palestinian Arabs, who accused the mandatory government of aiding the illegal embarkations and threatened to put an end to the prevailing calm in the region. Britain's last major efforts to reach a compromise between the conflicting aims of the Jews and Arabs took place at a conference held in London between January 27 and February 13, 1947. The gap between the parties proved unbridgeable, and the controversy over Jewish immigration formed one of the main obstacles. Given the circumstances, on 14 February 1947, the cabinet decided to transfer the Palestine question to the United Nations. At this stage, the cabinet lacked the willpower to deal with the impasse in which it found itself in Palestine. This decision should be seen in the context of two other far-reaching decisions that the cabinet had made at that time. The first was the crucial decision to transfer authority in India by June 1948, and the second, ending Britain's economic and military support to Greece and Turkey. The cabinet assumed that its decision would lead to an intensification of Zionist activity. The period between mid-February and September 1947, when the Palestine question was scheduled to come up in the United Nations, was regarded as critical. The cabinet realized that improved weather conditions would bring an increase in illegal immigration, and continued deportation to Cyprus would cause an intensification of incidents and terrorist activity on the part of the Zionists. Despite these fears, the cabinet rejected the recommendations and appeals of the Americans to increase the monthly immigration quota. Whitehall maintained its position, although the ministers recognized that the illegal immigration was the only subject on which the entire Jewish community in Palestine was united. British representatives in Arab countries made sure to counter Zionist pressure. They warned London of the dangers inherent in increasing the quota. Any concession on immigration, British diplomats pointed out, would encourage terrorist attacks against British lives and property in several Arab countries. The cabinet preferred not to provoke the Arabs. The Minister of Defense cautioned that any increase in immigration would result in active resistance by the Arabs, and that the present British forces in Palestine, if not heavily reinforced, would be unable to face active opposition by both Jews and Arabs. The cabinet's assessment of the expected increase in illegal sailings was well-founded. In February 1947, 3 vessels carrying altogether close to 2,800 illegal immigrants were caught along the coast. The prognosis was that thousands of illegal immigrants would soon set for Palestine. If the attempts to find an alternative to Cyprus were unsuccessful, the cabinet decided to increase the capacity of the camps in Cyprus to 30,000. In mid-April, British intelligence estimated that there were already 35,000 Jews strategically situated and ready for embarkation throughout Europe, as well as 19 ships immediately available with an estimated carrying capacity of over 20,000. Furthermore, there were an additional 14 ships undergoing repairs with an estimated eventual carrying capacity of over 17,000. As it appeared obvious that there was no way in which the number of expected illegal immigrants could be held on territory that was under British control, a suggestion was made to see whether it was possible to borrow an island from the Italians for the purpose. אני אצלי זה מדוד לפי הזמן שהוקצב לי, אז אני מדבר עד הסוף. אחרים לא דיברו, בעיה של היושב ראש. This proposal clearly reflected the British confusion and powerlessness. With no alternative sites for detention, the cabinet turned once again to the governor of Cyprus, now Lord Winstead, and asked him to increase the capacity of the camps on the island. Lord Winstead made it clear that there was no possibility whatsoever of expanding the existing camps, and the setting up of a third camp would provoke bitterness and enmity on the part of the local population. He expressed his concern over the adverse economic and political consequences that could be expected, not to mention the harm the decision would cause to British interest on the island. Holding more immigrants under arrest, he added, would necessitate reinforcement of the military units on the island, with all that entailed. Lord Winstead eventually agreed to add 4,000 sports in the existing camps, bringing the total capacity to 34,000. Crowding beyond this number, he warned, would evoke angry and justified complaints about living conditions in the camps. Given that deportation to Cyprus was not deterring the organizers or the illegal immigrants themselves, along with the estimates of the arrival of large number of illegal immigrants, the difficulties in finding an alternative to Cyprus and the desire to deter governments from allowing vessels carrying illegal immigrants to sail from their ports, various officials in Britain concluded that there was no choice but to deport the illegal immigrants back to the ports of embarkation. In the spring of 1947, the British began monitoring the movements of a ship called the President Warfield, which had entered French territorial waters from an Italian port in mid-June 1947. And on 11 July 1947, the President Warfield, soon renamed the Exodus 47, set sail from Sète in France with 4,500 illegal immigrants aboard. This was a better setback for the British, as they had invested tremendous effort in attempting to prevent its departure. Under the determined lead of British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, the British decided to deport the captured Jewish refugees back to France. The French government, under heavy pressure from the British, decided to permit the illegal immigrants to disembark in France, but the government made it clear that it opposed the use of force to offload the illegal immigrants. Efforts to convince the illegal immigrants to disembark of their own free will failed, and the British cabinet decided to deport the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust to the British occupation zone in Germany. The failure of the British in their first attempt to deport illegal immigrants to the port of embarkation and the serious damage it had caused London's image and prestige in the world opinion practically eliminated this method of combating the illegal immigration. Meanwhile, on 20 September 1947, the cabinet decided to evacuate Palestine, and there were increasing voices within government circles in favor of putting an end to fighting illegal immigration. The failure to find alternative to Cyprus, coupled with the renewal of sailings from communist bloc countries, made it clear that the difficulties besetting the campaign against illegal immigrants would only increase in the future. The problem of where to house the illegal immigrants became acute as information reached London of two large vessels, each with a capacity of 8,000 passengers, anchored in Romania. In October 1947, about 70,000 illegal immigrants were being held in Cyprus, while the maximum capacity of the detention camps on the island was put at 34,000. The colonial office insisted that it was not possible to prepare more detention locations, even temporary ones, within a short time, either in Cyprus or elsewhere. Thus, It proposed announcing that after the detention camps in Cyprus were full, Britain would no longer be able to halt the illegal immigrations. Foreign Secretary Bevin strongly objected to the Colonial Office proposal that the entire immigration quota be allocated to illegal immigration in Cyprus, and that Britain give up its struggle against the illegal immigration. Bevin insisted that as long as Britain was responsible for the administration of Palestine, the struggle against the illegal settlings ought to continue. During the 5 months between the UN Assembly decision on 29 November 1947 to establish a Jewish state and the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel in May 1948, the British deported more than 22,000 illegal immigrants to Cyprus. At the same time, though, the Colonial Office quickened the pace of removing detainees from Cyprus to Palestine by making them part of the unofficially increased quotas. In May 1948, 24,000 illegal immigrants were held in detention camps in Cyprus. The last deportees returned to Israel as late as January 1949. In conclusion, the illegal Jewish immigration to Palestine caused Britain considerable difficulties, especially beginning in the summer of 1946, but the pressure it generated could not match the pressure exerted by the Arabs. The Arabs succeeded in making the question of Jewish immigration and that of the illegal immigrants in particular a test case for Anglo-Arab relations. Britain's desire to win the Arab support for its plan for a solution to the Palestine question and the concern for British interest in the Arab countries overrode any possible benefits that could be driven from acceding to Zionist immigration demands. Fear of disturbances by Palestinian Arabs, which were likely to receive the support of various Arab countries, neutralized any possible countermeasures by the Zionists. Whitehall's refusal to increase immigration quotas or to halt deportation to Cyprus, as well as the continued struggle against the illegal sailings, even after the UN partition decision in November 1947, reflected the government's order of priorities. Britain did indeed succeed at apprehending most of the illegal immigrants who embarked for Palestine. Approximately 50,000 illegal immigrants of the about 70,000 who had sailed for Palestine were intercepted and deported to detention camps in Cyprus. Very quickly, however, London recognized that deportation to Cyprus was not in itself sufficient to aid or even limit the scope of the illegal sailings. Moreover, the shortage of detention locations became more and more critical as time passed. The decision to send the illegal immigrants back to the ports from which they had departed was to a great extent an admission of the failure of Cyprus' deterrent. Still, the deportations almost certainly obviated harsher reaction by the Arabs. From the Zionist perspective, the illegal immigration constituted the concrete expression of the link between the problem of the Jewish refugees in Europe, the overwhelming majority of them survivors of the Holocaust, and the question of Palestine. The fact that tens of thousands of refugees succeeded in setting sail for Palestine was itself a considerable achievement for the Zionist struggle, especially since all the detainees eventually reached the State of Israel. British actions against the illegal immigrants at times received wide media coverage, thereby helping the Zionists prevent the Jewish refugee problem from sinking into oblivion, especially when the American and European governments were preoccupied with rehabilitating their countries and the battle over the shape of the post-war world. Both the British and the Zionists were out to try to win over world public opinion, particularly that of the United States. Britain's propaganda campaign had to contend with the fact that the illegal immigrants were survivors of the Holocaust seeking to leave the displaced camps and the countries that had become the graveyards of their families, as well as with newspaper photographs and newsreels showing armed British soldiers on board destroyers transferring hopeless refugees, including children and women, from wrecked boats to deportation ships that look like floating jails. The British tried to deflect attention away from the agony of the illegal immigrants and to portray the Zionist activists as shrewd, unscrupulous people who were willing to exploit the suffering of the Jewish refugees to achieve their nationalistic goals. British officials kept restating that the illegal Jewish immigration was not a spontaneous exodus of desperate refugees, but a carefully organized Zionist campaign to force the hand of His Majesty government and increase the proportion of the Jewish population in Palestine. In the final analysis, in the winter of 1947-48, the British were closer than ever to admitting failure in dealing with the illegal immigration. The UN General Assembly decision in November 1947 to establish a Jewish state diminished the importance of the illegal sailings, although the Zionists continued to send ships and the British, fearing Arab reaction, continued their struggle until the establishment of the State of Israel. Thank you.
I'm a half Yeki, a half German. We're 14 minutes late. Okay. So our next speaker is Branca Arrive, a graduate student from INALCO in Paris, and we're glad to have her.
Is it okay? All right. Good morning. Between the beginning of the British Mandate in Palestine in 1920 and the White Paper of 1939, the conditions of Jewish immigration to Palestine got increasingly more rigorous. Due to the near impossibility for the Jewish population to leave Europe during World War II, the quotas assigned, 75,000, over a period of 5 years, were not even exhausted despite the urge of millions of Jews to immigrate. The White Paper remained the governing policy in Palestine until the end of the mandate, and while the gates of Europe gradually opened after World War II, the British authorities did not significantly modify the quotas even after the UN recommended the immigration of 100,000 Jews from DP camps following the Harrison Report. Immigration was limited to 1,500 a month, and shortly after the policy of deporting Jewish immigrants to Cyprus was adopted in August 1946, 750 of the quotas were allotted to immigrants coming from DP camps in Europe and 750 to those detained in Cyprus. The loosening of immigration restrictions after the adoption of the partition of Palestine of November 29, 1947, as well as the statements of certain British officials, hinted at the clearance of Cyprus camps before the British evacuation of Palestine. It seemed logical, after all, that once immigration restrictions were lifted with the end of the mandate, the Cyprus camps would have lost even their official raison d'etre and would have been dismantled by May 15, 1948. That, however, was not the case, and the last detainees remained in the camps until February 11, 1949. This paper sets forth to identify the chief obstacles to the immigration of the remaining detainees on the island and how those restrictions were circumvented in order to enable the immigration of some of the detainees before the ban was officially lifted in January 1949. So the issue of Cyprus camps clearance is announced as early as December 12, 1947, by Foreign Minister Bevin, stating that between now and the withdrawal, we do expect to clear Cyprus. We must do that. We cannot have illegal immigrants on British territory after that time. However, camp clearance did not appear as a major priority for the British authorities in their plans to evacuate Palestine. Jewish immigration to Israel was perceived as a threat to the evacuation of British troops, and there were attempts to interfere with it from the very start. Okay. The total evacuation did not coincide with the end of the mandate and was not completed until August 1948. On May the 14th, Conservative MP Toby Lowe claimed that allowing immigration before the evacuation of the troops would put their safety at risk because it would inflame feeling and upset organization at Haifa port, unquote. The Minister of Defense, Albert Alexander, decides that there is not enough deep water wharfage in Haifa port for both evacuation and immigration, and instructs to inform the Jewish agency to send immigrants to other places than Haifa. Thus, La Nitzachon, the first Aliyah Bet ship to arrive in the state of Israel on May 17th, landed at Tel Aviv and not at Haifa port, which was in the hands of the British until the end of June 1948. Apart from the issue of Haifa port, the British did not voice any major opposition to immigration from Cyprus until May the 30th. Yet, much to the frustration of the remaining detainees, that period was not used to dismantle the camps, and about 12,000 people were forced to extend their detention for another 8 months. What prevented them from leaving? On June the 1st, 1948, the British government decides to halt immigration from Cyprus of men eligible for military service based on an interpretation of UN Security Council Resolution 50, which calls upon all governments and authorities concerned, should men of military age be introduced into countries or territories under their control, to undertake not to mobilize or submit them to military training during the ceasefire. It is evident that the wording of the resolution does not mention a ban on immigration of men of military age. The fact that most men aged 18 to 45 in Cyprus camps had undergone at least some military training was never explicitly mentioned as an obstacle to immigration, as far as I know. On August the 4th, 1948, representative of the Provisional Government of Israel, Aubrey Eben, addresses a letter to the Security Council stating the discrepancies between the resolution and its interpretation by the British government, and citing the UN mediator Folke Bernadotte's confirmation that his own interpretation neither prohibited immigration nor placed a complete ban on men of military age. Bernadotte later added in his report of September 16, 1948, that this was a unilateral decision of the United Kingdom for which I was not responsible, and that so far as I was concerned, the same rules applied to immigration from Cyprus as from other places. However, Bernadotte was not indifferent to the issue of immigration in his attempts to find a compromise between the warring sides. In his report of September 16, 1948, he precises that regarding the immigration of men of military age, 18 to 45, I was concerned that they should not arrive in disproportionately large numbers, and that those who arrived should be placed in camps so that they would not be mobilized or submitted to military training. That was indeed the situation during the first truce, June the 11th to July the 8th, at the instigation of the government of Israel in its attempt to negotiate regular immigration from Cyprus during the truce. When the second truce was declared on July 18th, it was decided that male immigrants aged 18 to 45 should be placed in particular areas with special identity cards so they could be tracked. Although Bernadotte did not condone the British interpretation of the resolution of May 29th, there is no evidence of any attempt on his part to have his professed interpretation of the resolution implemented by urging Britain to lift the ban on immigration from Cyprus. On the contrary, the British authorities had sufficient confidence in Bernadotte's arbitration about Cyprus to declare on June the 6th, 1948, that despite their opposition to release the Jewish detainees from Cyprus camps, the final decision was in the mediator's hands. 1 month later, Bernadotte tells the press that the question of whether 11,000 Jewish refugees detained in Cyprus will be allowed to come to Israel depended on Britain. And when Sir Godfrey Collins remarked that Bernadotte himself had prohibited their transfer to Israel, he replies that Sir Godfrey was not quite in the picture. Thus, neither side appears to assume the role of decision maker. Why was the period between Israel's declaration of independence and the UN Security Council Resolution 50 not used to evacuate the camps? In his book, The Cyprus Detention Camps for Illegal Immigrants to Palestine, David Shari quotes the correspondence of June the 4th and June the 8th between Sir Godfrey Collins, Commissioner for the Jewish Detention Camps, and Rabbi Schreiboim, Jewish agency representative of the island. With Schreiboim's answers to the above question, he explains that formal arrangements regarding the 2 pan ships used for the evacuation were only completed by May 21st, that the Egyptians threatened to blow up the ships and the British refused to accompany them, that the British authorities in Haifa refused to allow the ships to land at the port, the only one in Israel suitable for boats of that size, and that the disinfection of the ships took longer than planned because it was not authorized in Haifa and had to be done in Cyprus. Collins' second question concerned immigrants who were not of military age. Why don't they leave Cyprus as soon as transportation has been provided? Schreiboim answers that they refuse to leave according to the selection criteria imposed by the British government. In addition to these explanations, it is important to point out that the decision to delay the evacuation only appears regrettable with hindsight, and that the British ban on immigration from Cyprus could not have been foreseen. Resolution 50 was not the first UN document imposing conditions on immigration to Palestine after the partition vote. On April the 1st, 1948, UN Security Council Resolution 46 stipulates that the 2 sides in the conflict should refrain from bringing and from assisting and encouraging the entry to Palestine of armed bands and fighting personnel, groups, and individuals, whatever their origin. This resolution, however, was never used by the British to ban immigration per se, and the unilateral decision to stop immigration from Cyprus after Resolution 50 did not only surprise Israel. The refusal to accept the British immigration criteria mentioned by Schreiboim did not last long, at least not for all the detainees who had the opportunity to leave the camps. Non-combatant immigrants arrived in Israel regularly until September the 7th, when immigration temporarily stopped, as that category of immigrants seemed to be exhausted. On December 14, 1948, Britain agrees to release 300 rabbis and yeshiva students as non-combatant immigrants. The suspension of Jewish immigration of men aged 18 to 45 in view of the Security Council Resolution 50 did not only affect the Cyprus detainees, but its interpretation varied from one British-held territory to another and equally included the American zones of Germany and Austria. Regarding the immigration from the British zone in Germany, for example, there were rumors that there were different rules for DPs and for Cyprus detainees, which were denied by Jewish agency official Ira Linton in a letter of December 8th to Moshe Sheptok. Sheptok replies that the difference is in the application of the principle, complete rigidity on the negative side in Cyprus and utmost flexibility on the positive side in the British zone. Another British-held territory that obstructed the immigration of military-age Jewish men to Israel was Aden in Yemen. In October 1948, JDC started evacuating the Chesed transit camp near Aden and bringing 2,000 Jews at the rate of 250 a week by air, but the immigrants only included women, children, and men over 50. However, the status of the detainees also played a significant role. Whereas the British government suspended the immigration of 254 Irgun and Lehi political prisoners from Gilgil in Kenya, despite the Kenyan government's announcement that they would be released 1 month after the end of the mandate, their decision was overruled by Count Bernadotte, who resolved that the repatriation of these men was not affected by the ceasefire terms because they were not immigrants but, quote, normal residents in Palestine. And arrangements for their return were made in early July. The Cyprus detainees never had the status of what Bernadotte would have called normal residents in Palestine, as they were not citizens of Palestine under the British mandate. When the Provisional State Council convened a few months before the elections to the first Knesset, Aryeh Altman, representative of the Revisionist Party, claimed voting rights for Jews in all the DP camps, but his proposal was rejected. Future Minister of Interior Yitzhak Greenbaum of Mapai observed that These elections are different from those of the Zionist Congress. However, the fact that most Cyprus detainees, apart from those on the Pan ships who sailed directly to Cyprus, had briefly been on Palestinian soil before being deported to Cyprus, gave them a special status in the eyes of some commentators. Thus, the revisionist party-owned newspaper Amashkif deplores the Provisional State Council's decision not to give the Cyprus detainees voting rights and calls the council's arbitration a double punishment. The article claims that though there might be a ground for not granting voting rights to DPs in Europe, considering that they've never been to Eretz Israel, this argument is totally unfounded in the case of Cyprus detainees who have not only been in the territorial waters of their homeland, but stepped on its soil. It is unlikely to imagine that the decisions of the British authorities or the UN mediator on the Jewish immigration would have been positively influenced if the Council had decided to grant voting rights to all the Jews abroad. However, according to the article in Amashkif, what stopped Ben Gurion from taking such a step was caution with regard to the voters abroad, because in that case he would probably have been compelled to accept the vote of Arab refugees living in the neighboring countries. Rather than challenge interpretations of Security Council resolutions, the Cyprus detainees and their legal representatives took the decision to challenge the laws of Cyprus and test the legality of their detention. According to a law, published in the Cyprus Gazette on August 13th, 1946, the day of the first deportation to Cyprus, with regard to illegal immigration to Palestine, the government may make an order that such illegal immigrants shall be detained in such place in the colony as may be specified in the order. The law does not specify the duration of detention, and there is no document detailing the names of all the immigrants, which is contrary to the legislation in force in Cyprus at the time. These arguments were taken up by attorney Lawrence Weston on August 31st, 1948, in an attempt to release the detainees by claiming they were illegally held. The application was refused on October 8th in view of the so-called removal of doubt law of September 16th, stating that every person who has been detained in a place established for the detention of persons under the principal law has been lawfully detained under the provisions of that law, and any person detained in such a place at the commencement of this law is lawfully detained under the principal law. The first turn in British Middle Eastern policy regarding Israel comes as a reaction to the first positive outcome of the Rhodes negotiations, when Israel agreed to release the besieged Egyptians in the Fallujah pocket near Gaza. After a favorable outcome of the negotiations for Israel, the Israeli press announces that the first signs of a change in British policy would be seen in the forthcoming debate in the Commons. The decision to liberate the Cyprus detainees is announced by Ernest Bevin at the parliamentary debate of January 18, 1949, and transmitted to the Israeli delegation in Rhodes by Ralph Bunch on January 19th. Bevin states that as a result of the more favorable situation that has now arisen, we are prepared to allow these men of military age to leave as soon as the Jews provide transport for them. Bevin does not respond to Churchill's remark that letting considerable numbers of Jewish immigrants of fighting age enter Israel means that the foreign minister is reinforcing both sides at once. He gives no detailed explanations to justify his decision, except that it was a result of a long deliberation while I have been handicapped by arrangements with other people, and I am more interested in doing things to get peace. Britain announced that rather than defy the Security Council resolution of May 29th, it would leave the final decision of introducing men of military age into Israel to the UN mediator. This time, however, this responsibility was assumed, and the detainees left Cyprus on February 11, 1949. The detention of Jewish immigrants in Cyprus, therefore, after May 15, 1948, is a result of intricate power relations based on policies lacking transparency and accountability. The partial ban on immigration, depending on monthly quotas, was replaced by a partial ban on emigration based on age and sex, which in many cases separated families. The detention without trial indicated no length of internment, and when the detainees were not released after the independence of Israel, there was no hint as to what to look forward to next. What made the moment ripe for their release is probably the unfolding of the negotiations in Rhodes that turned in Israel's favor and led to concessions on the British side, which included the clearance of Cyprus camps. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment, based on what Aryeh said, the British were very hypocritical. They liberated Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen also was a DP camp. They knew about Zionist activities. In a camp like Feldafink, the Allies knew about all the Zionist activities, and people were removed from the camps, and they knew about the movements. And in Italy, all the authorities followed all the movements, so it was like really obnoxious, the comments that the British were making. But, they had to be even-handed vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Okay, so we can take questions now.
Yeah, there are any Jews that decided to stay in Cyprus after the did any stay behind?
I know of maybe like one or two, I think, maybe, but not them. No, not.
I saw documents saying that one that from Greek origin went back to Greece.
Greece.
Yeah.
That goes with the I just want to ask Dr. Yacob, during the period that you mentioned, I think there was also movement from the British moved Jews from Cyprus to other countries like East Africa, Kenya, South Africa, for safety reasons in case Cyprus would be occupied by the Nazis. Yes, this is true.
Research, because there are thousands of archives still waiting for the researchers to go and to make the research there in the British archives and in UN archives as well. So these folders are actually separate. The folders belonging, referring to the Greek Christian refugees and to the Jews on the other side. That's why I was actually made my research focusing on the Greek Christian refugees.
I just add that about 1 year or 1.5 years ago, there is somebody, which I just forgot the name, wrote a MA thesis which was published in one of the journals about sending a couple of hundreds of foreigners, so to speak, from Cyprus, and they arrived to Nyasaland in Southeast Africa. This is a very interesting work. In the archives here, here, not far away from here, you can find a lot of files with lists of foreigners, so to speak, that had to be evacuated by the British in order to protect them. Some of them were Jews, but not only Jews. A lot of Germans, a lot of people from Holland, and other foreigners, so to speak, who were in Cyprus, under the fear that after Crete, Cyprus is the next step of the German forces. So there is some research, but not in the framework of the refugee problem.
Among them also Jews living in Cyprus, some families who came back afterwards.
About 30 Jewish families. By the way, they had to pay for the evacuation. This is the British now, once again.
After they came back,
Before the
1948, 1941. Yeah.
So what Yossi has said is certainly very correct. there were several rounds of evacuations from Cyprus starting 1941 with the Poles, and following that, the Czechs and Jews were moved first to Palestine and then to East Africa and the other faraway places. but that was during the war and for wartime contingencies, really.
Comment to Branka on. I really enjoyed the presentation. I just have a quick comment about the voting rights.
Yes.
Itzhak Greenbaum, who you mentioned, was the first Interior Minister of Israel, was in charge of the Interior Office and of organizing the elections, probably because he had previous experiences of 20-some years in the Polish Parliament. Now, in the first draft of the elections bill of 1949, there are voting rights for the detainees in Cyprus. And in Aviva Halamish book about Ya'ari, about Mary Ya'ari, she mentions that Ya'ari thought, and that relates also to my presentation, Ya'ari thought that the government decided that the Cyprus detainees will not be granted the voting rights because Mapam was stronger than Mapai in Cyprus.
But yeah, I found this information in Handa Jablonka about this altercation between the. Oh, okay. That was just very short. Okay. I found this information in Handa Jablonka that in the beginning everybody was for, and that Greenbaum decided not to give them voting rights. And she claims that Altman didn't do it for selfish reasons because his party did not have a majority in Cyprus. Arya Altman, a representative of Zohar, from Zohar. And it was not for his personal, she says, for his personal selfish reasons because they didn't have a majority in Cyprus.
And actually, Greenbaum ran in an independent party to this election.
Oh, okay.
Didn't get in.
All right, I didn't know that. Okay.
The mandate was 3,000 votes. So.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to refer to Professor Kochavi's paper regarding the place of the, so to speak, illegal immigration and the political pressure which was put on the British cabinet and its impact on the decision-making of the British cabinet in compare to the other, let's say, leverages like the terror in Palestine or like the situation of the empire in India, as you mentioned, in other places. I mean, can you describe generally the place of this affair of the illegal immigration and the Cyprus affair within the framework of policy making and decision making of the British cabinet from historical perspective?
I'm not going to give you another lecture. First of all, we are partners. I can expand my answer at the University of Haifa.
We argue who threw the British out. Actually, nobody threw them out. They decided about it.
Exactly. So you gave the answer. I think the illegal immigration, after all, played a minor role in the British decision. That's the reason I mentioned the fact that at the time that the British decided to withdraw from Palestine, they decided to withdraw from India. It was much more important, and they changed the whole relationship with Greece and Turkey. That was also much more important. Actually, the British decided to withdraw because they didn't have any money. And especially, I mean, World War II actually destroyed the British Empire. So that's...
The resistance was between 6 months or longer before the
Which resistance?
of Haganah and in Israel.
No, it was a few more. I mean, at least, I mean, since the end of the war. Even before.
While you were speaking, I thought to myself that it would be interesting to hear a British representative
must tell you, I'm an Israeli, but I believe I'm not speaking as an Israeli. I'm speaking as an historian that all my documents are British documents. I'm not telling my family story. And everything I quote from British documents, so what I try to present here, it's not Israeli interpretation of British policy, but actually it was the British policy. And the way I see it, I mean, you know, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or Israeli or I don't know what, or Palestinian, when you write about a historical event. At least we must rely on documents, and that's the reason we're speaking here. I'm not speaking at home in Hebrew with my colleagues. So I don't think a British will give a different interpretation as long as he relies in his interpretation on British documents, American documents, etc., etc.
Well, as a British academic, I think I'm probably the closest person here to comment on the British perspective. But Professor Kohavi, your paper reads like a TNA document, so it's very obvious that it's steeped in archival research from the TNA. But just as an off note, and I guess this question probably links to Branka's paper and perhaps to yours, I was wondering if both of you could perhaps say a little more. Obviously, Professor Kohavi focused a lot on the geopolitical situation, but a bit more on the special relationship and the pressure from Washington in terms of Anglo-American relations, and certainly Bevin's decision in lots of the TNA documents that I've looked at, the pressure from the US for these camps to close, and especially from pro-Zionist groups in America, certainly influenced Britain's decision to hurry with the closure of the camps. So I was wondering if you could speak about the special relationship and the impact of Anglo-American relations on the issue of the camps.
Well, just a few words. The special relationship is a term known in England rather than the U.S. You know, when Obama went to England, somebody taught him to talk about it, but otherwise, few people in the U.S. No, it's true. But Truman, yeah, there was a pressure from Truman. Yes, I don't think I know enough, but I know that Truman was influenced by the Harrison Report, and that yes, he did want to release 100,000 Jewish refugees. But talking about the occupied zones, there were the same rules in the American zone as in the British zone. And there was, I don't remember when exactly, by the end of 1948, there was an article in Palestine Post, it was still Palestine Post at the time, about how the American zone lifted a ban on immigration, but it depended on the mediator. So that means that there were two bans, one from the American authorities and then from the mediator. And it was announced as big news, but they were not really different from the British, in Germany at least, until the end of 1948. That's all.
As far as I know, there's a big difference between the American and British policy toward the Jewish DPs. Actually, the British refused to recognize all Jewish DPs as belonging to one people. They say there's not Jewish people, there are Romanians, Hungarians, Polish, etc., and all of them should return, repatriate to their origin countries. American policy was different. You mentioned the Harrison Report, but from as far as I know, I mean, it was important to report, but it was not the issue. The issue was the elections in New York City and the fact that Truman was never elected as president, and he needed a Jewish vote and money for the elections, and that actually influenced the U.S. policy. And as all of us know, that for, let's say, Secretary Marshall, for instance, Secretary of State Marshall, opposed the establishing of a Jewish state, and all the State Department and the other secretaries, and actually Truman made a decision because the elections in 1948, and you know, it repeats itself all the time in history. And U.S. in the beginning, American policy toward Jewish DPs was the same as the British, but because of pressure in the States, it changed.
I don't know if you agree, but there might have been an influence when Frederick Morgan was replaced by Fiorello LaGuardia. that made emigration from Poland easier. Because it was Morgan who claimed that it was organized, that it was not spontaneous, and then he was replaced.
Here again, as I see it, actually, the escape, what we call the Bricha from East Europe, it's not Morgan and the UNRWA general secretaries who made the decision. It was Stalin. He wanted to pressure the British, and he actually allowed Jews to flee from Eastern Europe in order to put pressure on the British in the Middle East. And I see it as a part of international politics and not domestic. I mean, of course, you can see all the stories, but always I ask myself, how come, tens of thousands of Jews succeeded in escaping Poland, Hungary, Romania after the war? Somebody had to make a decision. And who made the decision? Stalin. Why? Because he wanted to put pressure on the British in Palestine. So actually the illegal immigration served the Soviet interest. And until 1947, actually, practically, the Soviets supported the Arab cause. They changed their position in the famous Gromyko's speech in the UN only after they realized that actually the British are close to leave Palestine, and then they decided to support establishing a Jewish state. Don't forget another thing. The Soviets never recognized the Holocaust as murdering Russian Jews. They always spoke about killing Soviet citizens. They never spoke about the Holocaust. They never spoke about the murder of Jews. They only spoke about killing Soviet citizens. The change in May 1947 had to do with the big politics. What I just mentioned is forcing the British to leave the Middle East as part of the Soviet plan to enter the Middle East. Yeah, I mean the Soviets, there was a competition between the Soviets and the Americans. And each one of them, in the US it was in domestic politics, in the Soviet Union it was world politics.
Special question for Professor Aryeh. Forgive my ignorance. You mentioned the Morrison plan. Morrison-Grady. This is the same with the Trump of 100,000.
No. The 100,000 was actually a demand of the. It was started before that. Actually, the Jewish agency asked to transfer 100,000 Jewish DPs from Germany, Austria to Palestine. The British, of course, refused, as I mentioned in my lecture. And then was a Harrison report that you mentioned it. And he was a kind of he made a tour in the DP camps, and he recommended to transfer 100,000. And because of that, actually, the whole process started. No, Morrison-Grady is completely different. Morrison-Grady came after the Anglo-American Committee. I mean, his play. I mean, actually, it's not his. It's two people. It's American and British, and their plan was actually favor the British agenda for Palestine.
They suggested actually a most narrow Jewish state in Palestine. The first version of the Peel Committee, and this is why it was rejected strongly, of course, by the Jews first, and then they retreated from this. Morrison-Grady is the most unknown. There was a kind of a committee of two people to implement the Anglo-American report, Anglo-American Committee report of 1946. But they failed in their mission, and that was almost the last step in the trial to get Jews and Arab interests together in one partition plan. Then it was they left it and said, okay, now it's the problem of the UN and not only of the Anglo-American.
Here again, if you check the dates, you realize that the Truman in August 46 actually canceled the Morrison-Grady, and you ask yourself why, and the answer is the midterms elections of November 46. So everything, I mean, you have to see it. Unfortunately, I mean, you know, we're speaking about survivors of the Holocaust, etc., and people think about the human misery, but exactly. I mean, politics, actually, if you go into the documents and you try to see it in the perspective of the time, you can see everything that has to do with the elections or international politics, etc.
Very, very brief. The anecdote goes like this. It may be a true story. It was said by my father, said Geoffrey Collins, at the end when the camp was closed in January, and he had to give a report of the people in and the people out. Out of the total 50 and so thousand, in the end they found they were missing about 758 people, and he couldn't find the reason, and he was worried, and according to my father, he was wondering, and it was said to him, proposed to him, maybe Sir Collins, a mistake, a clerical error. You know, the Jews, poor as they are, maybe they made double entry in the books, so that he said, this must be it. He said, of course, it was the people who escaped.
So as we are 15 minutes late and we should have a small break for 5 minutes. So first a small break, just 5 minutes, and then for the next speakers, please keep the time limit. You don't have more than 15 minutes. Thank you.